So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this. Can you hear me? Can you hear me better now? It's better now. Good. All right. So, welcome to today's seminar, Maritime Security in the Baltic Sea Region. My name is Thomas Roslyng Olesen. I'm the head of the Maritime Research Alliance in Denmark, and we have been co-organizing together with Jessica Larsen here from DIIS this seminar, where we will be looking at maritime security in the Baltic Sea region. The background is, of course, the development we have seen in the we're seeing right now, and we have also seen in the past, rising tensions, also involving or affecting commercial shipping. We have seen the issue with ships transporting oil from Russia, very old ships, where there has been concerns about the safety standards, the insurance, and so on of these vessels going through the Baltic Sea. We've seen damages on underwater infrastructure, cables, and so on, also involving commercial vessels. And of course, this has also been met with reaction from the countries around the Baltic Sea. So tensions have been rising and is still rising as we speak now. And this is the background for the seminar today. And to shed some light on the development that we are seeing, we have invited some experts, and they will cover both the geopolitical, the legal, and also the technological aspects, and put a focus on the development we are seeing here. Our first speaker will be Jessica Larsen here from DIIS. Jessica is senior researcher here at DIIS, and Jessica will put the kind of context, introduce the context that we are going to talk from during today's seminar. Then we have three presentations. The first presentation will be Tobias Liebetrau from Center for Military Studies at the University of Copenhagen, and Tobias, he will focus on the geopolitical aspects of the situation. Then we have Professor Jacques Hartmann from Dundee Law School, who will focus on the legal aspects. And finally, we have postdoc Malte von Benzon from Aalborg University that will focus on the technological aspects and how technology also plays a role in the development we're seeing right now. After these three presentations, we will have a 30-minute panel debate with our speakers, moderated by Jessica. And here you will also be welcome to ask questions along the way. So, with these words, I think that, I would say welcome and leave the floor to you, Jessica.
Thank you, Thomas. My PowerPoint presentation. Dear audience, thank you for coming to DIIS for this seminar today, and thank you, dear speakers, for accepting our invitation to participate. Malte, I know you came all the way from Esbjerg by train, and Jacques, you actually came all the way from Scotland. Tobias, I think maybe you came by bicycle. But nonetheless, you still had to fit in the seminar in a time that's very busy with all the focus currently on the Baltic Sea and maritime security. Just a few words to introduce the seminar today. As Thomas maybe mentioned, this is our third seminar, or at least I will say it now, that we've held here at DIIS over the past year, diving into different maritime security maritime domains and the security challenges that they host. It has been a pleasure to collaborate with you from the Maritime Research Alliance. And actually, this is just the beginning of our collaboration. This is just a teaser. I will get back to that at the end of my brief talk. In our seminars, we have previously covered the South China Sea and the Arctic. The seminars are available on diis.dk if you were not here or if you want to listen to them again. And then today we turn our attention to the Baltic Sea to discuss the kinds of threats we are facing there and that we're hearing about in the media, and perhaps also to look at what we can do about it. This is obviously not a second too late, since Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which is now 3 years ago, imagine that, the Baltic Sea has become a zone of increased tension, despite the fact, or maybe because of the fact, that it has developed into what is sometimes referred to as a NATO lake. Of the 9 coastal states bordering the Baltic Sea, 8 of them are members of NATO since Sweden joined last year and Finland the year before that. I found this patch on the internet for sale. I don't know if it's serious or not, but anyway, there you have it. NATO lake notwithstanding, Shadow Fleet is transporting Russian oil through our straits to finance Putin's war in Ukraine. And at the same time, the vessels are posing environmental risks due to the Shadow Fleet vessels being old and ill-maintained. Yet, despite sanctions, the Shadow Fleet has grown. And somehow international law seems to leave little in the way of reaction or remedy. We will see. The hostile activity around our critical maritime infrastructure, with Nord Stream 2 as like the example of how hybrid threats have come to be a go-to tactic instead of, or perhaps as a supplement to, war. The many examples of damaged underwater cables, particularly in the last months, are of course further examples. Some investigations have been given up, others are ongoing. So of course we don't know the perpetrators and their motivations, but it's safe to say that the sea and the subsea are no longer neutral spaces, but have become platforms for power projection. What's going on at sea naturally relates to what is going on at land, with cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and espionage that complement the hybrid threats in the Baltic Sea. The response has to a large degree been militarized. Naval exercises, increased presence on both sides. It'll be interesting to follow the NATO's Operation Baltic Sentry and in which ways they're able to prevent and suppress all these activities. The photograph is taken on the 14th of January, when Nordic and Baltic NATO states met to establish this operation. With the establishment of the Maritime Security Mission, the Baltic and Nordic states also decided to establish a working group to look at the regulatory issues relating to the protection of subsea infrastructure. The legal framework is vague on mandating affected states to act. The law of the sea has some wording, and I'm sure Jacques will come into that, but it's not very strong, at least not strong enough to rely on to support that much action. There's also a cable convention, the so-called cable convention, which is a little more specific on international cooperation, but more is needed. The cable convention is from 1884, and more modern regulation would of course be preferred. I actually asked ChatGPT to help me find out which countries have ratified the cable convention and which countries have not. And the answer was, among the countries that have not ratified the convention, and I kid you not, the Ottoman Empire. So I think this answer says a lot. The question is how to go about producing new international law in a time with geopolitical tensions and these major fault lines that we're seeing in international relations. On threats, on law, on technological protection, we will become much wiser after listening to our 3 guest speakers today. Before I hand over the floor, I want to return to the teaser I gave in the beginning about collaborating with Thomas from the Maritime Research Alliance. After the summer holidays, I will be heading a new initiative here at DIIS called DIIS Maritime, which will examine how geopolitical tensions and hybrid threats at sea are affecting the operational conditions for the shipping and maritime industries. DIIS Maritime will assemble researchers on maritime security here at the Institute, and we'll be looking at diverse maritime domains, among them the Arctic, the South China Sea, the Red Sea, the Indo-Pacific, East and West African waters. So it's a broad initiative and a lot of exciting research is going to come out of it. We will be publishing it and we will also be disseminating it here on this stage at seminars and also at the Maritime Museum, MS Museet for Søfart in Helsingør. So do sign up to the DIIS newsletter on diis.dk to stay informed, and follow me on LinkedIn, and you'll hear much more, I'm sure. So with these words, thank you again all for coming, and I will now hand over the floor to our first speaker, Tobias Liebetrau.
Thank you, Jessica. I hope I managed to unmute this. It sounds like it. Perfect. Thank you for the invitation to say something today on Baltic maritime security. My focus is on hybrid war and the move that we are currently experiencing from the Baltic Sea being what at least the Soviet Union used to call a sea of peace to today becoming a sea of hybrid war. Because for a region that is heavily affected by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and quite heavily dependent on our transatlantic alliance with the US for security, developments in the past months have been quite worrisome, not least because of all of the cable cuts we have seen in the Baltic, but also because of the Russian advancements in Ukraine, and now the ongoing negotiations between Russia and the US, I think only makes us even more pertinent and important to discuss. But my focus today, as I said, will be on this surge in hybrid warfare, hybrid activities that we have seen. So a little bit less on the pure military side and sort of the risk of war and NATO Article 5 and Russia and NATO Lake, and a bit more on all of the stuff that we see below the threshold of war and below the threshold of armed conflict that is a real danger and a real threat to societies and the Baltic states, not least because these attacks kind of challenge the way we have set up our institutions to deal with security and defense, that is sort of the purpose of these attacks, is exactly to find our weak spots and to find some of the things that underpin Western societies, the way we have chosen to organize societies in terms of divisions of labor between the public and the private, between the military and the police, between civil authorities and police, and so on. So that's sort of the background of what I will be saying today. Then looking at the Baltic Sea and hybrid threats, we have, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, seen quite a few things. Sabotage, perhaps the most obvious and the stuff we hear the most about. We have seen various cable cuts, we have seen pipelines exploding at various occasions. A lot of this is still being investigated. We don't know exactly who is behind this. There's a lot of speculation. A lot of things point to Russia, to the Shadow Fleet, to some of these events being somehow either supported, sponsored by Russia, especially when it comes to the Shadow Fleet. But again, we don't know for sure what has happened, and what I hear is that some of the investigations into some of the cable cuts actually leave people a bit more confused than what we initially thought, where everyone yelled sabotage and Russia, and that perhaps some of this actually could be incidents. I mean, I don't know, and I'm not following the investigations closely, but at least that's what I hear. Then we also see, for instance, meddling with naval shipbuilding in Germany not long ago. We saw German warships being built, sabotage of that, literally people somehow obfuscating the process of building new naval ships in Germany. Again, allegedly, or most likely, people employed at some of these factories that sabotage naval building, pointing to another hybrid threat that is, of course, that we have insiders in various places in the countries, in the Baltic states, somehow affiliated with Russia. We have also seen academics being accused and being prosecuted in Estonia for having ties to Russia and the Russian intelligence service and having worked for Russia for a long time. So some of these things that we perhaps have thought of mainly as a Cold War threat and something that we see in Netflix series is also a threat. Then, as was mentioned before, also the Shadow Fleet. We see this destruction of infrastructure, we see a mapping of infrastructure, but we also at least here, that some of them carry surveillance equipment, other forms of equipment on board these ships that might be used should the conflict between NATO and Russia escalate. We see mapping of infrastructure, at least, that we know for certain. But we might also think in alternatives, and I'll come back to that. But this shadow fleet might also do other things. It might crash into a bridge, into a port. Things might happen that we haven't seen yet, but that we should perhaps pay attention to. Then we see GPS and ARS spoofing and jamming across the Baltic Sea, across the Baltic states, but also in Sweden and Norway. Disinformation campaigns, not as such perhaps a maritime security threat, but again something that is connected and also perhaps speaking to our distinction between the maritime and the terrestrial. To what extent should we sort of uphold that and speak of the maritime as something that is distinct? It is to some degree, of course, but there are also overlaps and things where we might see the two meet. Also again talking ports, talking bridges, talking things that are somehow both maritime and terrestrial. And then cyber attacks, both hitting ships, but again also something like ports where we see a lot of focus. So the list of threats is quite big, and we have seen a lot of things. So what does that then tell us? Well, it tells us something about, as I said, that this is something that cuts across a lot of the distinctions and concepts that we use to think security with, and one is between the public and the private, that a lot of the infrastructure being cut is run and operated by private companies and not by the state, not by government. So who's responsible for protecting it? How should it be done? Who should pay for it? That's some of the questions that are raised. Then also the question of military or civil protection that Jessica also alluded to. Is this something we should heavily militarize? Should this be a mainly NATO thing, a mainly Navy thing? Or should it be something where we need police, Coast Guard, or other forms of civil authorities playing a major role? Who should lead this, and how, and what forms of collaboration can we think of, both between the public and the private, but also between military and civil authorities, and what kind of questions does it raise when we have to confront risks that sort of play on these divisions that we have. Then also we see a lot of these threats being sort of cross-sectorial, that they have effects outside of the energy sector or the telecom sector or the maritime sector, which is also something we talk of as a sector in and of itself, that a lot of these threats are cross-sectorial. So we need sort of integrated responses also across sectors. In Denmark, we operate with a quite firm distinction when it comes to responding to threats. We have the way we manage it is built on the sectorial responsibility, and how well does that fit if threats are crossing across those. The same on the industry side. Perhaps we need closer collaboration also between energy companies, telecom companies, shipping companies, and all of the companies present in the Baltic Sea, in the maritime space, confronting these threats. So that's some of the questions this raised. Then turning to some of the political response that we have seen, because of course these threats and activities have not gone sort of without notice in 4 different languages saying more or less the same thing, that we live in an age of unpeace. And these are quite recent quotes. And to me at least, they speak to the Nordic countries and Germany having now sort of agreed that we live in an age of unpeace, and that this is a hybrid war. Now it's not just separate activities against Nordic, Western, Baltic countries, but this is actually part of a larger hybrid war, and that we do not live in an age of peace, but an age of unpeace, whatever that might mean or entail, but that is the political response or the political imagination of the situation we find ourselves in, and that this requires some new responses. And some of those we have seen already and have been ongoing for a while. NATO it's actually quite fast in setting up a critical undersea infrastructure coordination cell, easy to pronounce, in the NATO headquarters not long after the bombing of Nord Stream. That was then followed by the Maritime Center for Security of Critical Undersea Infrastructure at NATO's Maritime Command, looking exactly into some of the legal complications and the public-private relations around this infrastructure and how to protect it better. And then more recently, the Baltic Sentry was agreed on in January. And that form of collaboration also means new sort of technical measures for NATO. And I wrote it down because I cannot remember it by heart. But one of the things is a new NATO concept called mainsail that provides comprehensive seabed-to-space situational awareness for NATO and NATO allies. And it introduces a state-of-the-art cloud-based data exploitation environment, empowering data scientists, engineers, and analysts to perform patterns of life analyzing using artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms. These algorithms address the ever-changing threat landscape, ensuring robust and adaptive security measures. And I mean, that sounds great, doesn't it? So at least what NATO envisions is the situation awareness, is the idea that we can sort of establish some kind of picture of what's going on in the maritime space below the surface, and then we can react quickly to these threats. Detect and track threats, enhance situational awareness, improve response capabilities. So that's all good. And they even set up a special task force X specialized in delivering capabilities that exploit emerging and disruptive technologies, including autonomous systems and artificial intelligence, that they will sort of use with the Baltic Sentry as sort of a test case. So we actually see quite a lot of development, not only at this political institutional level and a lot of speeches by Mark Rutte and others telling how much NATO is doing and how great it is, but also on the more operational technical side, we actually see NATO deploying new technologies and at least trying to increase situational awareness and counter these threats. Then, moving from the less militarized to the less militarized, we also see developments within the EU. Also, following Nord Stream, von der Leyen quite quickly proposed a 5-bullet plan for the EU to do more in this space of subsea infrastructure protection. And one thing was the European Maritime Security Strategy. I mean, that was already being worked on at the time, but that now contains quite a lot on critical maritime infrastructure protection and the ways the EU imagines itself being involved in that. Following that, we have seen some recommendations on secure and resilient submarine cable infrastructure. And again, these are recommendations from the EU. The EU do not have yet any sort of legislative power in this area. So these are only recommendations. National security is still a prerogative with the member states, so the EU finds itself in a bit of a difficult position when this comes too close to national security, to being matters of defense, matters of national sovereignty. The member states are pushing a bit back, so it's a balance act for the EU. We see it even more prominently with the Network and Security Information Directive, the second version of that is right now to be implemented also in Denmark by the new Ministry of Societal Security, and the Directive for Critical Infrastructure Resilience, where the EU is actually doing quite a lot of more traditional national security work by imposing legislation on critical infrastructure protection through its market mandate. So the EU is also a player in this space, mainly on the regulatory side, a little bit less on the protection side, but at least the EU is there, and I'll come back to that also, looking a little bit to the future and the way ahead. But then we have also seen a lot of unilateral actions. We see different forms of defense collaboration and new agreements across the countries bordering the Baltic Sea. And we also see, for instance, individual surveillance efforts being intensified. We have seen that in Denmark, for instance, that we are stepping up and are actually being more present in our territorial waters, in our exclusive economic zones, trying to survey what's actually going on, mainly above the surface, but at least it's something we pay increased attention to. So we see a lot of countermeasures, but again, looking especially at the shadow fleet, but also cyber attacks, it's most likely hard to imagine that this will deter the aggressors from doing this, and that we can sort of put an end to it. But at least we are doing something. Then, what else could we do? Well, perhaps a bit obvious. We could increase the collaboration we already have, the capacities, the capabilities. We can definitely do more, and we are, as I said, heading in that direction within NATO, within the EU, across the Baltic states. So that is something that is already going on, and where we actually see quite a lot of development. And following from that, perhaps what is needed is a discussion on who should lead this, and to what extent, again, should it be militarized? To what degree do we want our navies to be involved in this, and to what degree is this coast guards? Is it the police? Is it a more civil authority issue, countering these hybrid threats? And does it matter when we move from seeing these activities as independent, single standing things, looking at it as something that is then accumulated and over time amounts to some kind of hybrid war in the way we respond to this? Does it change our way of thinking deterrence, our way of thinking punishment, our ways of approaching these issues when we think increased collaboration, capacity, and capability? And doing that, we might draw inspiration from other European seas. I mean, in that sense, of course, the Baltic is unique, but we also have a lot of infrastructure in the North Sea. We see a lot of collaboration in the North Sea. Both Belgium and the Netherlands have proposed different forms of information sharing platforms when it comes to critical maritime infrastructure. So perhaps there are places where we can look and see, can we learn something? Can we perhaps also look at where we diverge? What is actually the unique things that we see in the Baltic Sea? Perhaps one could think also in more European solutions. Could we establish some kind of European investigation team, for instance, when it comes to some of these subsea infrastructure incidents? Again, do we want this to be NATO responding? Do we want it to be national responses? Could we imagine some kind of European Europol, Frontex kind of thing with people having a certain expertise in approaching this? I don't know. But I think that we need kind of more alternative thinking, and thinking that goes a little bit beyond what we already have and some of the structures and institutions that we're used to think with. And that also, that brings me back to this idea of imagining alternative forms of hybrid threats. That it's cool that we're really good at surveying our subsea data cables, but again, we might also just envision a big ship crashing into the Öresund bridge, or into a port, or something different, drones flying into some of our infrastructure, into the ships. I don't know. I guess that's only a matter of imagination. But when we have these discussions, not only focusing on the things that we have actually seen, but making some room for also coming up with alternative ways of attacking us, and looking at our own sort of soft underbelly, and thinking a little bit about where is it that we're vulnerable, and where would we kind of attack ourselves in a way, perhaps not sharing that with the Russians or with anyone else, but paying a bit more attention to that, and not only, or not focusing so much or only on the seabed infrastructure. I think those three things are quite important to keep in mind. But happy to discuss all of this further, as a lot of it is sort of meant more as thoughts and proposals, and less as sort of things that are sort of clear cut and can be put in place immediately. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tobias, for this overview, looking back and not least looking ahead. I would like now to welcome Jacques to the stage.
Thank you very much. Will you help me with my PowerPoint? Well, I can start by saying thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here when the sun is shining. So yes, I'm going to give you a legal perspective, and what I'm going to do is to give you, if I can change the slide, some context, a little bit of explanation of international law and maritime zones, what the rules are for interdicting ships that are sailing in various places around the world, and then I'm just going to look in on two stories that I'm sure you're all familiar with, which is Yipeng 3 and Eagle S. One stopped nearby, and the other one was detained by the Finnish authority. And the reason I'm going to tell you this is that the law of the sea is quite complicated. So when things or crimes take place on land, it's fairly easy to understand who's responsible and what you can do, because it falls under the sovereignty of a state. In international law, it becomes a little bit more complicated. And what we have to understand is, you've already heard reference to the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea from 1982, and it splits the seas into various maritime zones, and I'm just going to explain a bit more about them. But to understand these zones, you have to understand the negotiations that was taking place beforehand, because there was lots of states that wanted to be able to sail all over the world with no interference from other states. Those are mostly the Soviet Union at the time and the United States, and all other big maritime nations like the United Kingdom as well. And then there was lots of newly established states that wanted to have as much control over the seas that were close to their coastal lines. And we can always see that balance in the law of the sea today. There's states that want to have control, and then there are states that don't want to have control. Now, and also just to kind of put a little bit of context to this, is important to understand that Denmark creates this connection point between the Baltic Sea and other international seas, and that means that we have 3 straits in Denmark: Lillebælt, Storebælt, and Øresund. And there are special rules for these, both under the Law of the Sea Convention from 1982 and actually also under the Copenhagen Treaty, which I'll come back to. And that's important to understand. And why is there so much focus on that? Of course, after the sanctions were introduced against Russia in December 2022, we have this thing that's called a shadow fleet. Lawyers are not particularly happy about the term shadow fleet because there's nothing very shadowy about them. They're just registered in other countries. They, of course, sail in and out, and there have been instances where subsea cables or pipelines has been disrupted. And then the question I'm always asked, well, why don't we just stop these ships and arrest the people on board and prosecute them, for instance, for criminal damage? And that's one of the things I'll try to explain why we don't. So this is kind of a map of the various maritime zones that we have. So the first nautical mile we call the territorial sea, and we treat that to all extent and purposes as land. So states have full sovereignty over that area. They can legislate and they can enforce their legislation. So when I talk both about making the laws, we call that legislative jurisdiction, and I talk about enforcement jurisdiction. That's basically applying your laws as well. Now, the further away we go from the coastline, the less powers the states have. When we are outside the 12 nautical miles, there's no more sovereignty. We have certain rights in certain zones. And actually, even within the territorial sea, we also have a right of what's called innocent passage. And that means ships that are flying a foreign flag can sail through. We can write a whole book about what's innocent and what's passage, but I'll not do that today. So, but that's important to understand, and then coastal states can only interfere with a ship's passage is prejudicial to its peace, good order, and security. Nice, clear kind of wording there that we all know what mean, basically. And you can also take certain measures to protect your marine environment, and in certain limited circumstances, which are outlined in Article 27, you can enforce criminal law. In practice, that doesn't really happen. States tend not to touch foreign flag ships unless what happens on the ship has a direct effect on its territory or it involves one of their nationals. And we can also see that in Article 27. I promise I won't do lots of slides just with kind of legal text, but I will just do 27, because it says criminal jurisdiction aboard a foreign ship, the criminal jurisdiction of the coastal state should not be exercised. So the presumption seems to be that you do not exercise criminal jurisdiction about foreign flag. And then it comes with a long list of exceptions, and one is the consequence of the crime extend to the coastal state. Imagine you stand on a ship and you shoot somebody on land, for instance. Could be something like that. Or if the crime is of a kind to disturb the peace of the country or good order of the territorial sea. Again, not very particularly clear wording. Now, again, people always ask, so, well, if we have this kind of vague wording, why don't we just exploit that and then arrest ships? Well, because it's not just important what we can do, but it's also important what other states can then do afterwards. So if Denmark, for instance, interprets cable cutting as something that has effect on the coastal states, then other states can do the same. And then Denmark can no longer object to a Danish flag ship, for instance, being stopped off the coast of China and some other countries. And then just to continue with Article 27, it says, considering whether or not or in the manner an arrest should be made, the local authorities shall have due regard to the interest of navigation. So again, a very strong emphasis of innocent passage and not to interrupt ships that are sailing around. So I'm just going to go on to the contiguous zone. So again, we're moving away from the coastal state. We come out to 12 to 24 nautical miles, and there we can enforce custom laws, fiscal and sanitary rules, and immigration laws. So where we went from having full capacity to making rules, we now only have specific areas. And we can actually only enforce these violations of these laws if they happen in the territorial sea and you're sailing away. So already there we have very little power. And then we go out into what is called the exclusive economic zone. That's up to 200 nautical mile from the coast. And there states have, we call them sovereign rights and not sovereignty, over natural resources, and they have jurisdiction over certain maritime activities. So if you build an oil platform, for instance, you can have jurisdiction over that oil platform. Now, then when we go even further, we come out in what we call the high seas. And on the high seas, no states can exercise jurisdiction. So you cannot legislate and you cannot arrest anybody. That's the starting point. And we talk about exclusive flag state jurisdiction. So it's only the state whose flag is on a ship or the registration of the ship that has any kind of jurisdiction. So the presumption in the Law of the Sea Convention is that if something criminal happens, then the flag state will deal with that matter. So, and it's actually the same in the 1884 convention, which was mentioned before. I don't have it on my slide. It has about 40 state parties. It has the same system. If something happens and you criminally damage a cable, the presumption is the flag state will deal with it. So if it's a Chinese flag state, it's a Chinese authority. A Russian flag state, it's the Russian authorities, which of course is not very helpful in many of these cases. And then we also have a right of hot pursuit, which is that if a crime takes place, you can continue after people. Now, these rules are to some extent relevant, but they're not so relevant when we're talking about Denmark, because Denmark has an international strait. We have special rules in UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Seas, which deals with straits. Straits are essentially just passages of water that connects two areas of the high seas or the exclusive economic zone. Now, Denmark, when they came party to the Law of the Sea Convention, they made a declaration that the 1857 Copenhagen Treaty applies. So we shouldn't apply these rules, but we should apply the rules from 1857. And people get very surprised that we have all these old treaties and we still use them, but that's not uncommon at all. Now, the Copenhagen Treaty says in Article 1, I promise no more legal text, but I can't quite help myself, no vessel shall henceforth under any pretext whatsoever be subjected in its passage of the sounder belt to any detention or hindrance. That's still applicable today. That's generally read as if you have a power to legislate, but you have no power to enforce that legislation. So Denmark is under a commitment not to stop and search ships or arrest people, for instance. Now, what then are the exceptions? Generally, the Law of the Sea Convention will allow us on the high seas or other areas to deal with piracy, slavery, drug trafficking, unauthorized broadcasting. We can have a United Nations Security Council resolution like we had in the Gulf of Yemen, for instance, when we dealt with piracy before. And there's actually one more thing, and that is if it's a ship is not flagged or it's suspected of not being the registration of the flag that is flying, then you can go and control that. Now, this one is political unrealistic in the current environment, so we're not going to get a Security Council resolution. Unauthorized broadcasting, drug trafficking, and slavery is not relevant to subsea cables either. I personally believe that it could be treated as a form of piracy. It's me and 4 other people in the world that believe that. And the reason is that is because I think people read the definition of piracy in the wrong way. So normally we say that it has to be there's 4 elements that normally has to be fulfilled. The 2 most important parts is it has to be for private ends, so it cannot be a state ship. And most textbooks on international law will say there have to be 2 ships, 1 ship attacking another. But that's actually, there is also a provision that says, or property outside the jurisdiction of any state. So I think there is scope for dealing with attacks on subsea cables of privacy. Why is that important? Because every state in the world that's party to the Law of the Sea Convention then have a right to go on board the ship. They have a right to arrest the people that's on board the ship, and they have the right to prosecute them afterwards. So it gives us a form of universal jurisdiction. States are not doing that, maybe because they're reading the classic textbooks of international law. I'm writing an article on this now, so if anybody wants to discuss that, I'm happy to explain in more detail. I just want to kind of finish off with these two cases, because we had Yingpeng 3, I'm sure everybody in Denmark has heard about that. That was under suspicion for having caused damage to 2 fiber optic cables in the Baltic Sea. And we have these, they have a transponder on the ship so we can see where it's been sailing, and it's been sailing in a very suspicious way with its anchor down. What happened then was, of course, it stopped over here outside Danish territorial waters. We waited for a while. A Chinese delegation came up. Other nationalities, including Denmark and Sweden, went on board. They inspected the ship. Chinese went off, so did all the other ones, and it sailed away. Why? Because of the 1857 convention, and because Denmark didn't have jurisdiction for something that didn't happen anywhere near Denmark, basically, where it happened. That's the legal explanation. Of course, there's also a real policy explanation. Denmark has a very big interest in shipping and doesn't want other countries to stop Danish ships. And this ship was flagged in China. You don't want to start a fight with the Chinese either. The other thing that then happened that's very interesting is the Eagle S. It's a bit similar kind of a situation, except it damaged the power line, or suspected of having damaged the power line, and 4 telecom cables. And it's quite important because electric lines are much more expensive to fix and takes a much longer time. The latest estimate I heard was it costs about $30 million to fix an electronic cable. And it takes quite a long time. Now, what happened with the Eagle S was that it sailed into Finnish territorial waters. I've had no explanation why they voluntarily sailed into Finnish territorial waters. The Finnish then, with an overwhelming use of force, landed with a helicopter, which was just a show of power, in my opinion. They didn't normally just sail out and say, hello, can we go on board? And it's currently arrested the ship, and they are prosecuting them for criminal damage under Finnish law. From what I understand, and I've not seen any clear kind of explanation of this, and this is not unusual either, from what I've understand from Finnish colleagues, they're prosecuting because of an effect that took place on Finnish territory. We have that both in the Law of the Sea Convention, we have that as a matter of general international law, so it's not as such particularly controversial, but it is a bit unusual for this to happen. And of course, the big difference between this is a Cook Island flag ship, so you're not messing with any big powers, plus Finland hasn't got the same kind of interest in international shipping as Denmark does. So the politics behind this is very different as well. And that's all I had to say. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them afterwards.
Thank you, Jacques, for laying out all the legal articles that are really central to when states can and cannot act. Malte, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. So I'm Malte von Benzon. I'm from Aalborg University Energy Department. I have a postdoc. I have a PhD in automatic control of underwater vehicles. And that is my background. I'm part of the research group on subsea and underwater technology. Currently, we are 7 people, and we are hiring. We have an open PhD position and 2 more to come. So, if you know anyone, reach out. Our main research topics are in autonomous robotics and sensor integration, sensor fusion, and that's sort of our background. We've gone into virtual environments for AI. And recently, also surveillance of subsea infrastructure. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So yeah, the challenge is that in Denmark we have a lot of subsea, especially cables, connecting us to the rest of Scandinavia and Europe, and also to the UK. We have more than 8,000 kilometers of subsea cables in Denmark. We currently have 14 wind farms and 21 oil and gas sites. And in recent years, we have seen an increase in sabotage of these infrastructures. So today, it is actually impossible for Denmark to survey our underwater infrastructure, at least 24/7. There are some possibilities to monitor areas, and of course there's also using ships and stuff like that. But having something which is monitoring it at all times is not possible. And of course, if we were going to have something which was actually going to survey our infrastructure at all time, it would be very resource demanding, especially manpower-wise. There's also a lack of unified data sharing platform, such that the private entities can send in data to governmental entities, such that we can make the right decisions or gather data and find out if there's been an intruder or what's going on. Then for detailed inspections, when we want to look close to cables and subsea infrastructure, we are very limited to using mainly acoustics, since optics are very dependent on the turbidity of the waters, and we can see that far underwater. In Esbjerg, where I'm from, we can see maybe 20-30 centimeters in the harbor. Of course, it's better elsewhere, but it's a limitation, especially when the weather is bad. Stability gets worse, and it's more difficult to operate. Today, when the energy operators survey their platforms for cracks or something like that, which is a typical operation offshore, they do it in the summertime because that's when the weather is good. It lowers the cost of operations, but when we're going to do it in wintertime or when it's a bit windy or something like that, it gets much more expensive and much more difficult. So this is just an AI generated picture. It's not. It's just for visuals. It's not. Okay. So when looking at the Danish perspective, of course, the other speakers has also been into that. We have a large share. We are quite dependent on subsea infrastructure. There's not been much attention to surveying critical infrastructure. Of course, every time there's an event happening, the interest goes up, but then for a while it goes down again. There's also an issue of defining the responsibilities. When I talk to the wind and mainly the wind operators, they don't know are they responsible for surveying the infrastructure. I know that in Poland they've made a national law where they actually responsible for surveying their infrastructure, but in Denmark we don't have defined this responsibility. Meanwhile, we are still vulnerable to sabotage and espionage on our subsea infrastructure. So it's actually possible to survey our subsea cables with known technologies. And this leads to my next slide. This is not. I'm just advocating for this. It's not something that which I have done. I was lucky enough to be invited to see the results when they published it. So OX2 is a Swedish wind operator, much like Ørsted here in Denmark, and they've come up with a security concept to achieve maritime and underwater situation awareness, but for limited space. So typically for a wind farm or something like that. So they invited in different private companies to showcase their technologies, and we're actually able to put together a quite nice consortium, which includes both the above water and underwater surveillance. So from an the concept that OX2 has presented is quite nice, but one of the difficulties is that it's also very demanding on manpower, because there's no automation of the data which is being gathered. It's still people who are going to look at it and see what's going on, and it requires skill to look at the sonar images. For above water, the radars are much more efficient, but for underwater, there isn't the same thing. So we see that there is some. We have put together a solution together with other universities and also in our group, which could sort of solve this or lead to 24/7 situation awareness underwater. So the first step is to get a data sharing platform where we can where private entities and governmental entities can share data on survey data, and we can get an overall threat detection and report it to the relevant entities. We then pose a dynamic surveillance with using robotics such as underwater robots and also unmanned surface vessels, where they can go out and look in more detail when a ship is somewhere where it's not supposed to be. We can move an unmanned surface vessel out and have a robot in the water to see if there's something going on, or if there's a fault or a threat which is detected. Often it will just be a false flag, so it will also be quite expensive to go out to everything if we have a 24/7 surveillance of our infrastructure. Then there is this remote sensing using primarily DIIS cables, distributed acoustic sensing, which is a newer technology using fiber optics. You can lay out a fiber cable and up to 600 kilometers, I think, and get an acoustic profile around it. It also requires, there's a lot of data. It's a large amount of data which is created from these fiber optics. So there's also a lot of processing which should be done. And lastly, there is placing strategic stationary sensors such as sonars or hydrophones at, for example, wind farms or at transformer stations on wind farms. Could be because one of the difficulties with using DIIS, because it seems very smart, but it's also limited in its capabilities. But hydrophones and sonars can actually get an image underwater, and we see that all four domains are needed in order to get a solution which can survey underwater 24/7. So we have actually established a sort of at the moment it's a network, but in time we would like it to be a center called CPAS. It's us from AAU and SDU, DTU, Aarhus University, Force Technology, and DHI. And the idea is to be a hub which takes in the private sector, which comes in with the technologies, much like the OX2 concept, and then taking in the industrial problem owners. So what are the problems that the industrial owners have, and of course also the defense operators, and then be a hub for underwater technology innovation. So last year we sent in an application for Danish roadmap for research infrastructure. It's 90 million. It's mainly us at AU and together with DTU to establish new research infrastructure and to unite the research infrastructure in Denmark. So to conclude, Denmark's subsea research, Denmark's subsea infrastructure is critical and it's vulnerable. There is currently current monitoring methods are too slow, expensive, and it's fragmented across different entities. And we propose this four-layered surveillance system, which can enable online autonomous surveillance of our subsea infrastructure. And of course, this requires collaboration between research industry and the government. It's quite essential. And I think with this, we could actually get underwater situational awareness. So yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Malte. That was fascinating. I'm certain the Minister of Defense is listening online to the technological solutions. May I ask the three speakers to come up onto the stage, and please help yourselves to some water. We've now reached the Q&A section of the seminar. We will be passing a microphone around if you have any questions. Can I please ask you to just state your name and if you have any organizational affiliation, and then a brief question, and also you can direct it specifically to a speaker or just to anyone. So any questions? Yes? You'll just get a microphone so that people online can hear you as well.
I'm president of International Club and Press. It seems as if you could solve the problem of surveillance in Greenland with microsatellites. They can establish a system with microsatellites. Couldn't you do that in bigger scale over the sea areas? And then when a ship is based on a critical situation, a critical place, you could use AI to automatically detect if it's a problem or not.
Thank you. Shall we gather a couple of questions?
I've got a question as well, actually.
Yeah, you have a question. Go ahead.
I just don't understand what the point is of surveillance. So why is it we want to have surveillance of subsea cables? So if we know, already now, when you break a cable, we know it. We know more or less where it's broken as well. So what's the added value of surveillance? If you don't have a ship nearby that can go and stop the sabotage, I don't really see the point of it. But maybe there is a point that I'm missing.
All right, great. Any other questions in this round? There's one there.
Fine. Marius, I'm just...
You can just get a microphone. Yeah.
Hi. Hello. Marius, I'm just here for myself. I'm just looking at the card and notice Kaliningrad. What impact actually does this have on Baltic Sea and and the other way around? Are you frightened or threatened by them? Understand the question?
No, was that for me?
No, for everyone,
Okay.
because you're talking about the Baltic Sea,
Yeah.
right, and the technology and the military, but also when Kaliningrad is in the Baltic Sea as well,
Mhm.
are you affected by them? And the other way around, can you control them to not get espionage or something else? Because it's still under Russia control, right?
Mhm.
Great. Okay, so that was a question on satellite, on why we should be surveilling, and then Russian presence in the Baltic NATO lake. Anyone want to start? Do you want to start, Tobias?
I can start. It's on. Well, the first question first. I don't think it matters a lot whether it's microsatellites or just satellites. We already have them up there. They're already taking in a lot of data, and we already have 1,000 platforms looking at satellite data. We have the CISA in the EU, that's the Maritime Agency. We have NATO doing it. We have the individual countries doing it. It's not a lack of satellite data. That's the issue here. It's how we use the data we already have. And all of the many measures, looking at data, looking at satellites, looking at other forms of already available data, and how we fuse that, and how we make all of these systems talk to each other, how we make all of these institutions talk to each other. We have a lot of stuff going on already. We don't need that much more. And that brings me to the surveillance question, because, I mean, I think it does matter, because, I mean, at the end of the day, I guess what we really want to do is we want to survey in order to do something proactively, to stop people from cutting these cables or whatever it is. Not only to be reactive and sort of after the fact be better at investigating and prosecuting, but actually stopping people before the event. And whether that is illusionary or not, maybe it is when it comes to these cables, because it's such a vast space. There's so many of them. And again, even the data handling itself, if we look at sort of AI and DIIS and all, I mean, again, who should do this? I mean, you don't have a data center if you're Ørsted, right? Maybe you have to build one. You would if you were to sort of store all of this data, and then you have to go through it. Or would it be the Danish Defence Intelligence Service doing it, or the Danish Navy? And do they want to collaborate with the private companies? I mean, there are so many follow-on questions from these things. It's not as easy as it seems, sadly. But we already have a lot of things in place, and we should start focusing on that and using it, and instead of already just inventing something new. I think that's important. And then Kaliningrad, yes, I mean, that to me it quite obviously matters that we also have Russia as a Baltic state, and that they have their missiles there, and they have St. Petersburg, which is a big harbor, both in terms of oil and navy and so on. That definitely impacts the situation, but in many ways. So I won't go into that.
Yeah, Malte, do you want to answer?
Yeah. Okay. In regard to satellites for seeing underwater, so satellites are primarily a platform for adding other sensors on. So you typically use a hyperspectral camera where you can basically just a camera. So you can only see so much down into the water. And that's also a problem for Greenland. So you can only see maybe maximum 10, 20 meters underwater. So that satellites are not going to solve the underwater issue. Unfortunately, it'd be nice if it could. But for maritime surveillance, situation awareness, satellites are very important and are used today all over. Yeah. And in regard to the importance of surveillance, I mean I'm from a technological perspective. I'm not into politics, but personally, I would say that of course the recent events where ships are just mowing over a cable, it's difficult to imagine that you could have any way of surveying that would add any value. But when you look at the Nord Stream explosions, where they were placed explosives onto the infrastructure months in advance, maybe we could have seen that. And do we know that if there's any more? I mean, I don't know. So
That's a good answer, actually. We would need to know if there's explosive placed on pipelines and cables around the world. So, I agree with Tobias as well that I don't think satellite, or there's a lack of data necessarily. I think a big problem that people overlook is that there's no institutional framework for dealing with this. We have an international maritime organization that deals with things regarding to the law of the sea, with the international, or we got something similar for aviation, for instance, but there's nothing in no international framework that deals with cables. And what often happens is that, as also you were pointing out before, people don't know whose responsibility it is, basically. UN doesn't want to touch it either, so it's kind of left by itself. And the institutional framework we have is mostly private companies. The cables are mostly owned by private companies, sometimes consortiums of private companies. The ships that repair them are mostly privately owned as well. And so far it's gone well, and nobody's really thought about it, but maybe we need to sit down and think about the whole framework, since we are highly dependent on these cables.
Tobias, yeah.
Just a very quick two-thinker on the surveillance. I mean, I guess it also depends on who you ask whether this is important and why it's important. And what we want to achieve with it. Because looking at the more proactive responses, I think that's often something we want as a military or as a state, because we want to be able to sort of prevent Russia or Russian-sponsored or Russia-supported, whatever entities in doing harm to us. But if you actually ask the subsea data cable industry, they say, well, this is our main issue is fishery, right? It's anchoring, it's stretching, it's the fishing vessels, and they're actually very, at least that's in my impression, is that it's super hard to prosecute the sort of fishing vessels or the companies behind the vessels when we see cable damage. So for them, for instance, a more reactive way or a more reactive response, or being able to sort of pinpoint they did it at this hour with this anchor or this dredger, would actually help the industry a lot. So I guess it also depends on to whom we direct the question of surveillance.
No, that's a good point. So that's a bit forgotten these days after we've seen the Eagle S and the Yingpeng 3 incidents, that most cables are actually caught by accident, by fishing or by anchors. We have got rules for that. There are rules for what you're supposed to do if you fish up. Sometimes fishermen fish up a cable and they cut it because they don't want to lose their nets. That's not what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to lose their nets and then they get compensation for the nets, but sometimes they don't do it. And yes, in those kind of areas, of course, it would be helpful if you could point out. But even then, if it happens, for instance, off the coast of Greenland, there's no way you can get there very fast and tell them not to cut the cable. And if we're thinking about criminal prosecution, we also need to understand what are the rules then, because if you don't have jurisdiction, you can't legislate, then you can't prosecute either. In political science, we like to talk about there's some kind of hybrid warfare. The lawyers think, what's that? Either it's war or it's not war. If you cut a cable, you can easily be in a war scenario, which means you can then use force, and that means that the legal response is to sink a ship, for instance, that's trying to cut your cable. Is that where we want to go?
Another question. Yeah, wow, we have three here. Yeah, okay, so we start with you, and then Thomas, and then a little further back.
Okay, thank you. My name is Carsten Pelder-Müller from the Cambridge Heritage Research Centre. I was wondering, now we're talking about stopping people from cutting our cables. There have been discussions also about what about resilience by increasing redundancy, so that if they cut one cable, then, well, we've got another way to pass whatever we want to pass through these cables. That would at least decrease the attraction of cutting our cables, because you would give us some costs, but you would not really achieve stopping anything going on through the cables. So what about that? How would that sort of fit into your prospects for preventing cable cutting? Now, I just heard that the fishing industry is in fact a much greater menace. So we might anyway need more redundancy in our cables. Thank you.
Yeah, Thomas?
Yeah, Thomas Roslyng Olesen from the Maritime Research Alliance. I have a quite specific question for you, Jacques, and that is this Monday I read on Lloyd's List that the Estonian Ministry of Defense, they are opening up for acting against vessel damaging underwater infrastructure outside of the territorial waters of Estonia. And they specified that they want to do this within UNCLOS. So are there any, is this just impossible, or are there any kind of exceptions to what you just mentioned where you can actually act outside of territorial waters in such a case?
And then there was a hand, there.
Bjarke Bøtger, I'm from Industry Association Danish Maritime, so we are the industry association of the providers of maritime design, maritime equipment, ships, but also maritime services such as underwater and surface drones, as well as satellite builders and satellite operators. It's great to see that many people attending, and it's also great to see that the organizers have chosen to include both a military and a legal and a technological perspective. Very often the latter is forgotten when discussing maritime safety and security. So thanks a lot for that. I have a question regarding what the representative from Aalborg mentioned about fiber cable technology. You mentioned that you could have a sound image of what's going on. If I understand that technology correctly, it can help to actually detect anchors approaching a cable, but can you say something about how well in advance? That of course depends on the speed of the anchor being dragged and so on, but how far are you able to detect, and how far is that technology? Is that commercially ready, and is it even being tested in some of the cables that some of the damages we have seen? Is it already in place? Thanks a lot.
Thank you. We'll take one more question, and then.
Hi, sorry, I'm Ansis, just an independent person, very interested, so no fancy name for me. I just wanted to ask, we talked a lot about hybrid warfare today, and one of the damage of hybrid warfare, of course, there's the physical aspect of it, but then there's also the psychological aspect of fear. And from a legal, let's say, perspective, could you use that as a way of maybe prosecuting the actions of these ships? And also from a maybe a geopolitical perspective, is there a way that we can kind of unite and use very strong messaging? Because right now it seems very fragmented, the way we've handled these situations. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. That was a very diverse bunch of questions. If we start with Jacques on the Estonian legislation, I don't know if that deals with piracy maybe, and then the question about fear and geopolitics here at the end.
So I'm gonna go all legalese on you now, I'm sorry. It depends, I would say. I think there is an option, yes. So if it depends on who's responsible, if it's a state or a private person. If it's a state, I would go on the Article 50 or 58.3, which talks about 58 gives you every state a right to lay subsea cables, and it also puts an obligation on the state of due regard, and that's quite a familiar standard in international law. If it's not a state and you want to go after the private individual, need to have some kind of jurisdictional basis. I would go for Article 101A, litra 1, and if you take out all the kind of superfluous words in there, it says piracy is any illegal act of violence or any act of depredation committed for private ends by the crew of a private ship and directed, and this is the very important part, against property in a place outside the jurisdiction of any state. Now, for me, that easily fits cable cutting outside the territorial sea. But yeah, as I said, we only got 4 people in the world that thinks that at the moment, but I'm working on changing that. You do bring up actually a good point about fear. So what I'm on research leave at the moment, I'm just trying to find various treaties that we could potentially use, because most international law says, let's negotiate a new treaty. Yeah, but that could take 40 years if you're unlucky. Let's get a Security Council resolution. Not going to happen, basically. So it's much easier if we can use existing law. And one avenue potentially, when we're talking about the pipelines in the Baltic Sea, for instance, that was blown up, is the Terrorist Bombing Convention, because that also talks about destruction of property. And then, although fear is not exactly an element of the crime, that's normally where we go when we think about fear. We think about terrorism. That's another legal avenue you could do. But I'll stop with the law now.
Fascinating. Malte, there was a question about the sonar dimension of fiber technological cables.
So in regard to the distributed acoustic sensing, I'm not an expert on it, but it's not a new technology. It has previously been. It's basically just using a physical principle, which are also already available in the cables, and just analyzing that. So it's actually a box you put it in the end of the cable. So it has been used. I know Ørsted uses it for temperature instead, but it's the same principle. They use it to find cables which has been what do you call that?
Damaged.
No, not damaged, but if they have been uncovered, so they want their cables to be covered. But if they are uncovered, they can use the same principle for temperature measurements. And recently we have been looking into more. Can you actually see intruders like small vehicles? But I would say, imagine that an anchor, you can see that from quite far away, maybe even kilometers, because acoustics travel very far underwater. So.
Yeah, Tobias, there was a question about redundancy, but you can answer any question.
Yeah, but I think they are quite related, at least the redundancy and the fear question. But maybe I'll just start with a comment on the more technological one. I mean, my impression is that DIIS, I mean, we're quite far from it being sort of fully functional. Yes, it might work from shore and then X kilometers out. I think 600 is... I mean, some might try to sell you that, but I don't really think that works at the moment. At least that's not what I hear from industry by large. But again, I'm not an expert. And then perhaps smart cables might also be a way, and using the repeaters in the cables as a way to do better surveillance. But no matter what, I still think we also face the issue of, do we implement this in the infrastructure that we lay, or do we install it in the infrastructure that's already there? And what can this technology actually achieve? Also looking at the question of the explosives that are already placed, most likely near a lot of our infrastructure. I would at least imagine that's fairly likely. And do these technologies actually help us when it comes to that, or is it more the unarmed autonomous vehicles underwater that should help us there? Then on the resilience and redundancy, I mean, definitely that's an issue, and I think that's also why we actually haven't seen, especially when it comes to the fiber cable cuts, any effect, right? That is because we have a lot of redundancy. Luckily, in most of Europe, of course, there are some island states with less redundancy, but in general, we are quite well off in Europe, and that's also why individual cable cuts is not that big a deal if you look only at the effect of data distribution and internet and accessibility and all of that. And then that brings me to the fear question, or the psychological question, that there it impacts us, right? Or at least we have a lot of discussion. It instills fear in us. Perhaps it will sow some anxiety, and perhaps we will support Ukraine less, or we will distrust our government, or whatever. So I think that those two are actually in a way connected. But also we need to look at, when we talk resilience, not only the difference between countries or between regions, because quite obviously Finland is, when it looks at energy, very different from Germany, right? Or Germany also when it comes to subsea data cables. I mean, Germany is not relying on subsea data cables. They can cut all of them that connects Germany, and they're still well off as long as we have things coming in across the Atlantic. So we also need to pay attention to sort of the importance of the individual pieces of infrastructure. Not all cables are equal. Not all of this infrastructure is the same when we look at what they deliver. Most of the cables in the Baltic are quite old because we were quite quick in picking up digitization in the northern part of Europe. So these cables are very old. They don't transport a lot of data, most of them, unlike some of the newer cables across the Atlantic. So we also see a big difference in how much data these cables carry, and that also matters in terms of their criticality, which is something the EU is looking into, trying to map all of the cables and see which ones are actually critical, what type of data goes through the individual cables. But that's a lot of work, and it's very, very hard to get your hands on that data because that data is privately owned. And a lot of the companies don't even know we don't even know, no one knows what type of data goes through these different cables. So, I mean, again, just to say that there's so much work behind all of these easy solutions and why can we just not protect and all of that there's a lot of work, and actually a lot of work also going on. But it is quite a complex matter, sadly.
Yeah. All right, I saw Fiona had a hand, and there's, 4 here. Okay, Fiona.
Great, thank you very much. Fiona McAway, I'm currently at the Queen Mary Centre, Copenhagen University. Thank you to all the speakers. I wondered, we've been quite a lot of focus on the cables and sabotage, but I wonder if perhaps Jacques or the other speakers could unpack a bit some of how possible it is to use the law to proactively to tackle some of the issues around shadow fleets and the environmental risks that they pose, or indeed the security risks when they turn off the transponders.
Great. Sorry, I lost track of, okay, there.
Hi, Caroline from the British Embassy here in Copenhagen. So I have a question for Jacques. So you mentioned one of the key problems is that there is no institutional framework to deal with cables. And I was just wondering if you could put some words on who you think should be responsible for that. And you're all more than welcome to provide an answer. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Over,
Thank you. Kirsten Kåre-Jensen, Birkbeck, University of London. We've just heard that the EU is now expanding their sanctions against the shadow fleet and including a lot more vessels. And I'm wondering how can they actually implement it?
What can they implement, sorry?
The sanctions against the shadow fleet.
Good question. There were 2 other questions. No. Nope. Okay. So okay, over here, and then we'll take a round of answers.
My name is Johan. I have no affiliation. I wanted to hear whether there was differing responses in the Baltic compared to other places where cables have been cut as a part of hyper warfare. I'm thinking of Taiwan in 2013 and recently in 2025. And I was wondering if the standard operating procedures differed in any way from the ones we're seeing in the Baltic, and whether we could learn anything from that. And in the case, I know that in none of the cases there was actually any form of arrest made, and I was wondering if Jacques' analysis of Taiwan being very dependent on maritime trade factors into that, or whether something else is taking place. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. Again, lots of different questions. Should we maybe start with Tobias?
Yes, on the question of responsibility, I think that depends on for what. I mean, is it the military? Is it that kind of responsibility? Then it's NATO. If it's for something more civil, something critical infrastructure protection, it's the EU. If it's, or it could also be a national issue. I mean, I guess no one is responsible for cables as such. Then we have some international legal texts, and that might be the UN. But I think that the answer to that question depends a lot on the specificity in terms of responsibility. Also, the private companies are responsible to some extent, at least, or they most likely also want to be responsible because it's their infrastructure, they pay for it. They are relying on customers actually thinking that they deliver the services they want to deliver. So I think, there are many responses to that outside of sort of perhaps the pure legal one. Then the standard operating procedures and China, Taiwan vis-a-vis the Baltic. I think that the political situation is so different, or that makes it difficult to have sort of a standard operating procedure. Perhaps we can agree, or countries might talk about sort of interpretations of international law, for instance, as a way, and I think that is one of the things that the northern and Baltic countries discussed at the Baltic Century, and also meetings leading up to that, is exactly what should our standard operating procedure be? How should we respond, and what are the difficulties in establishing that if a ship is registered in China vis-a-vis the Cook Islands? And that is actually what at least countries are trying to achieve by having these talks, but I'm not sure that there's that much to be gained from the Taiwan-China situation. But we have some, I don't know, that could also be an answer. But one thing related to that, and that is also a question to all of you, if anyone knows, and to you, is that how come Eagle S actually entered Finnish waters? Why didn't they stay out? Why did they enter? Because what I hear is that they were lured in by the Finnish, that the Finnish told them that we see you have an anchor problem. Please come and we will help you. And that's why they entered Finnish water, and then they were being arrested. But I don't know if that's true, but that's what I hear. But if anyone knows, then I would love to have it confirmed, or to have a different story.
Great. Malte, do you have any answers?
Maybe I have a question. So what I don't get is that when you have a shadow ship or something like that, why don't you get out with the ship and then underwater robot looking what are they actually doing when they are hovering around our wind farms or critical infrastructure? Why don't we go out there and actually have a look at what they're doing? I don't know.
Yeah. Anyone who wants to answer that one?
Well, the British recently declassified an episode where a Chinese spy ship was visited by a submarine. So they just came up from the water basically and said hello, and that was enough. And then they left and they sailed on. So yeah, why don't we do that a bit more often? We probably don't have enough submarines, I would imagine.
There were questions about EU sanctions and about this.
There was quite a lot of questions. I'll try to see if I can deal with all of them. The international organization, thanks for that question. So the private companies already have their own organization, and they would probably be the best place to start. But I think we need a new international organization, and I know this is not the political time, to create international organizations. There's hardly any support of ones that we have, but I think ideally that would be the best. As for ensuring compliance with the sanctions, I think it's very difficult. We have to also be realistic in that it's not every country in the world. In fact, it's a small group of Western states that introduce sanctions. And I mean, there's no international law that complies the rest of the world to comply with them. So that's a bit tricky. As for being proactive under UNCLOS, UNCLOS is quite limited in what we can do. I think there is some scope under Article 220. I'm sorry for just dropping article numbers on you. Paragraph 6, which talks about a threat of environmental damage. And one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is there's been Denmark and some other countries started inspecting and asking ships if they're insured. And I think you could link those two basically and say uninsured ships poses a greater threat. It would be quite a new development, but I don't think it's completely unrealistic development. Much of this is actually depends on what states are willing to do. I think there is scope within UNCLOS to do quite a lot of things. And I think that was all. Yeah, I know there was also why did the ship Eagle S sail in? I don't know that either, but it's not the first time this has happened in international law. Basically, we have there's a very famous case in international law. It's called the Lotus case, which lots of other things build upon. It's about 100 years old now, and it had the same thing. There was a coalition in the international seas, and it sailed into port, and everybody, why did you sail into port? Otherwise, they would not have exercised jurisdiction over you. But I think that's a very important question to have answered.
The captain didn't hear your lecture on international law. I guess. We're actually out of time, but I know that Tobias would like to just comment, so you get the last word.
Very quick. That was that was not why I wanted the two finger though. But that was on the question of the responsibility or what to do. I was just thinking in the context of the UN, we have seen discussions on the public core of the internet as being a sort of global public good, or some countries have pushed that idea that actually parts of the internet should be established somehow as a global common good. So perhaps cables could fall into that part of infrastructure that the digital parts of our lives rely on. That could be a different way of thinking it, at least.
Great. Well, super interesting. Thank you so much for your great insights, and thank you also for the questions. That concludes the seminar. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.